Today, 29th July, we have further examples of what is now becoming the regular pattern. More news of more big Russian advances on the Ukrainian battlefronts. And here I must emphasize the word big, because the Russian advances are now taking place with ever greater speed right across the entire line of contact. I've spoken on several occasions on these programs, on this channel, about a slow motion collapse of the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. We are moving beyond a slow motion collapse. The tempo of the collapse is accelerating, not perhaps at dramatic speed. We're still some weeks away, I suspect, before the Ukrainians reach a critical point, but that critical point is becoming closer. Now, the big news yesterday is confirmation of something which I have suspected was the case for some time, which is of a very significant presence of the Russians in Chasov Yar. I'm talking about Chasov Yar, west of the aqueduct, the Seversky Donets Canal, as some still refer to it as. In other words, Russian positions right in the center of Chasov Yar. Now, about a week, 10 days ago, I seem to remember, there was film which was published, which showed a Ukrainian artillery strike on a Russian position in a building in central Chasov Yar. There was a lot of discussion and speculation about this particular attack. Some suggested that it was a mistake, that the Russians couldn't possibly have reached that point deep inside Chasov Yar by that time. We didn't get any more reports of that nature for some time. And as I remember, that particular film has gradually been forgotten as people, just in discussing the Battle of Chasov Yar, have been focusing instead on the continued Russian advances east of the aqueduct and northwards towards the village of Grigorievka. I have made repeatedly the point that the fact that we are not getting information from a particular location does not mean that fighting is not actually taking place in that location. It absolutely does not mean that the Russians, for example, are not advancing in that location. It simply means that the Russian authorities, and by the way, the Ukrainian authorities, have tightened up information, reporting from that area, probably because the battles in that area are becoming intense and are giving taking on a decisive quality. And I've often said that when the information blockade is lifted, we generally find the Russians advanced in positions far beyond those that most expected them to be. This is the pattern in the fighting in Avdiivka, and it's been the pattern in the fighting in Krasnogorovka, at least in the early stages of that battle, and it's been the pattern again in Chasov Yar. Now, the latest pictures and the latest reports confirm that the Russians have indeed crossed the aqueduct in force, and as far as I can tell, they control the entire stretch of territory west of the aqueduct, along the entire line that the aqueduct passes through Chasov Yar. So all of the area west of the aqueduct is now controlled by the Russians. And we are told, and I've previously suggested that this was most likely the case, that what happened was that the Russians crossed the aqueduct to the north of Chasov Yar, somewhere to the west of the village of Kalinina, and that they wheeled south and advanced deep into Chasov Yar from the north. And I remember pointing out some time ago that a report by the TASS news agency strongly suggested that this was how the Russian operation was in fact conducted. And again, that appears to be what did in fact take place. The Russian troops who are spearheading this assault, perhaps they are the Russian troops who are in their entirety carrying out this assault, are the paratroopers of the much storied 98th Airborne Guards Division of the Russian Army. In other words, paratroopers. And they now control, as I said, the entirety of Chasov Yar, in the central area of Chasov Yar, on the west side of the aqueduct. But it is clear that they have pushed well beyond the aqueduct itself, and, well, they do seem to be in control of a significant area, part of the residential area of Chasov Yar, that lies immediately west of the aqueduct. Now, beyond this area, there is apparently an industrial zone. It looks different on the maps from other parts of Chasov Yar. But anyway, there is an industrial zone which is made up of various factory buildings. This industrial zone has a built-up area, the built-up area where the Russians are now present, immediately to its east. Then there are forests and open fields to the southwest and to the northeast. And then there are some other residential areas projecting outwards from this industrial area, basically to the northeast, to the northwest and to the southwest. So the Russians first have to capture the residential area that they're now advancing through. Then there is this area of industrial buildings, and then beyond the industrial buildings there are these two other residential areas that they also need to capture. But importantly, it doesn't seem as if there is a network of villages around Chasov Yar in the same way that there was around, say, Bakhmut, or as there was around other towns that the Russians have been seeking to capture. It looks as if Chasov Yar, perhaps because it's relatively speaking on a hill, is a fairly isolated place. So I think that most likely means that it will be relatively straightforward for the Russians to bypass Ukrainian defenses in the industrial area by moving their forces, especially in the north, through the open fields. Further south, in the southern area, maybe the Ukrainians will be able to use the woods that are there to establish defense lines. Who knows? But anyway, whatever. The point is that the Russians are now fighting deep inside Chasov Yar. And it is likely that over the course of the next few weeks, 2 weeks maybe, they will have captured the entire residential area east of the industrial zone. Then, of course, presumably, in some form or other, the fighting will move to the industrial zone itself. Maybe, as I said, the Russians will advance from the north across the aqueduct as well. Again, I'm not going to try to guess in advance how the fighting is going to play out, but probably the Ukrainians will try and make a stand in the industrial zone. Industrial buildings in Ukraine can sometimes become formidable defenses, but it would be a misconception to say that factories in the fighting in Ukraine have always proved difficult for the Russians to capture. I remember, for example, that in Bakhmut, the Russians, the Wagner organization to be precise, was able to capture the major industrial buildings in Bakhmut very rapidly within the course of just a few days. So I'm not going to predict the course of the Battle of Chasov Yar. Now, some weeks ago, the Ukrainian intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, admitted that Ukraine had concentrated all its best troops in two places, in Chasov Yar and in the Kharkiv area, to hold back the Russian advance across the border, which at that point just started. And the Ukrainian troops who are defending Chasov Yar are therefore amongst the best that Ukraine still has. But it's clear that even they cannot hold back the Russians for very long. And anyway, one way or the other, the Battle of Chasov Yar is now approaching its critical point. My own guess is that within about 2 months, the Russians will be in full control of the town, perhaps depending on how fiercely the Ukrainians continue to resist. The collapse in Chasov Yar might come faster than that. We'll just have to see. Anyway, that is the most dramatic piece of news that we've had over the last 24 hours. Confirmation of the extent of the Russian advance in Chasov Yar itself. But in other places, the situation for the Ukrainians remains very, very alarming indeed. And the area that is now attracting the most attention in the media is not Chasov Yar, despite the importance of this town. It is in the area close to Pokrovsk, the various villages located to the west of Avdiivka and Ocheretino, which the Russians have been clearing one by one. Now, this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry did confirm that the village of Volcha in this area has indeed fallen under Russian control. This is a village very close to Progress. And before I continue discussing the latest developments in this area, I just wanted to return to that topic of the Ukrainian troops who were supposedly surrounded and put up their resistance in near Progress and then fled from Progress. Because, well, I've noticed that this story is starting to appear in various places in the media. I noticed that even level-headed commentators in the West, like Michael Kaufman, for example, have adopted it and have citing it as examples of, Ukrainian resistance and how the Russians apparently or allegedly have failed to capitalize fully on Ukrainian disorganization and advances, and that the Ukrainians are still able to execute maneuvers and to extricate themselves from difficult situations. An awful lot of this sort of thing. Let me say again, first of all, that the only evidence we have, the only information we have that the Ukrainian troops in this area north of Progress were trapped at all comes entirely from the Ukrainians themselves. No Russian official source has ever confirmed an operation, a situation like that. And by the way, until the Ukrainians themselves started to talk about it, Russian reporters, the many Russian reporting channels, had not said anything about it either. The reality, or rather, shall we say, the facts that we know, putting aside these claims about the entrapment of these two battalions and their successful retreat, that are coming from the Ukrainians. The actual facts that we know, the facts that don't look to be disputed, are actually these: that the Russians were advancing rapidly towards the village of Progress, that the village of Progress was widely acknowledged to be central to the defense positions that the Ukrainians had established east of the key city of Pokrovsk. That there are also facts about Progress itself that suggested that the village ought to be very defendable, and therefore that the Russians would have difficulty capturing it. Firstly, it is located apparently on an elevation, a hill. I'm not suggesting that this is a high elevation, but it is anyway on higher ground. Secondly, it appears that it does include some of the more solid apartment buildings that one finds in some of these villages, which were constructed by the Soviets and which can be converted into very effective fortified positions. And thirdly, we were also told that Progress had in fact been fortified by the Ukrainians in the past, that fortified positions had been created in Progress years ago, back in 2014 and thereafter, when Progress is supposed to have become a major component part of the so-called Poroshenko line, a defense line created by the Ukrainian military during the presidency of President Poroshenko, the president who preceded Zelensky in office. So all the facts point to a desire by the Ukrainians to defend Progress and to hold the Russians back there, at least for a time. In fact, what actually happened is that the Russians rolled up to Progress and the village fell under their control, to all intents and purposes, without a battle. The Ukrainian defenses in Progress simply collapsed. And then, following the collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Progress, we get the story about the 2 battalions that are supposedly trapped and the men of these battalions evacuating westwards despite orders that they should stand and resist the Russians. I have to say that putting all these facts together, it looks to me like what actually happened is that the Russians advanced towards Progress and that the Ukrainian troops, maybe 2 battalions who had been tasked with defending this village, instead of putting up resistance, simply turned and fled, and did so disobeying orders, allowing this village to fall under Russian control very rapidly. Now, there have been lots of other explanations. If you go to Michael Kaufman and people like that, Roland Oliphant in the Daily Telegraph, there's talk about a disorganized and botched rotation and all that kind of thing, and that this somehow left Ukrainian units surrounded north of Progress. It seems to me a much more straightforward explanation is that the village fell because it wasn't defended and because the people who were charged with defending it simply fled before the Russian advance. And a story has been spun about defenders, or at least soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, heroically escaping from encirclement, basically to conceal that fact or to try and explain away that fact. The key point, and I've made this many times, this is the last time I'm going to make it, but I just want to make this clear again. The key fact is that by the Ukrainians' own admission, not only did progress rapidly fall under Russian control, but these Ukrainian soldiers, who everybody agrees fled, did so in disobedience of orders. So a rout, a collapse, a failure to defend positions has been spun into some kind of heroic stand against the Russians, which resulted in a successful escape from encirclement. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on this further. I don't propose to return to this topic again. It's just that I'm seeing report after report, article after article appearing in the media about what took place with this entrapment, supposed entrapment. Maybe it is as these reports say. Maybe troops were indeed surrounded and did indeed retreat and did indeed manage to escape intact. But to me, based on what I know, as opposed to what we can guess, it looks instead as if there was a disorganized, chaotic retreat from Progress by soldiers tasked to defend it, who retreated without orders. That's all I'm going to say. Now, anyway, Volcha has fallen. The Russians have now apparently reached the village of Zelanye, and they are pushing beyond Volcha, and they're pushing all northwards from Volcha to another village called Veselye. And there are reports, and I've heard claims that there are also pictures, though I've not seen these pictures, that the Russians are now in control of roughly half, perhaps even more, of Veselye as well, which is about to fall. And to repeat again, Veselye is an important village because it lies immediately to the south of the main road leading from Progress to the small town of Grodivka. And if Veselye falls, the Russians will be in control of this road and will have reached Grodivka itself. And Grodivka is the last settlement, the last major settlement before, on this road, before the road arrives at Mirnograd, the major suburb of Pokrovsk, lying to the west of Pokrovsk. So, important, very important developments in this area as well. And also, over the last 24 hours, we've had further reports, mostly from Ukrainian sources, speaking about further Russian advances northwards towards Vozdvizhenka, this village that lies immediately to the south of the other big supply road, the supply road from Pokrovsk and Mirnograd to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar. And anyway, the Russians are apparently gaining more ground around Vozdvizhenka. They haven't yet launched an operation to storm that village, but all the indications are that that operation will soon come. So, a major crisis for the Ukrainians in this area. Now, they've been trying to send what reinforcements they can to try to plug this vast hole, this widening, ever widening hole or breach, if you like, in their defense lines that the Russians have created in this area since the fall of Avdiivka, but they're not succeeding in closing this hole, this breach. In fact, it looks as if, to the extent that Ukraine is able to rush reserves to this area, all that is happening is that the reserves are being destroyed. There is a rather dramatic film circulating of two HIMARS launch vehicles trundling down the road. Somewhere in this general area, it's not exactly clear to me where it was, but somewhere close to these villages which have been captured by the Russians, one by one. Again, by the way, striking to see how completely deserted the roads now are. It's only military vehicles that move along these roads, and they move in complete isolation. But anyway, two HIMARS launchers, wheel launchers, trundling up one of these roads. Of course, the Russians, who seem to have extremely thorough surveillance of these roads, detected them, and both HIMARS launchers appear to have been destroyed. It's been suggested by some that this was done as a result of a Iskander-M strike, a missile strike, in other words. I have to say, to me, I'm not an expert in these things, but I saw two explosions, one where each of these vehicles was moving, and to me it looked more likely that they were destroyed either as a result of artillery shelling, or perhaps even by Russian troops ambushing these vehicles, or perhaps as a result of drone attacks. I'm not able to say. But anyway, there we go. So a rapid Russian offensive in the Pokrovsk area, the Russians continuing to get ever closer to Pokrovsk. And of course, there is also news in other places as well. Ukrainian channels all now admit that the Ukrainians have completely pulled out of the key area of Krasnogorovka, place which has been fought over since March, but that the Ukrainians have now finally and completely retreated from this central area of Krasnogorovka. The Russians have released film of how they're advancing towards the road, how they've advanced towards the road across more fields and territories. This is the road from Konstantinovka to Vuhledar, that the Russians have advanced across more fields, looking to cut this road in other places, establishing a broad front, in other words, along this road, presumably in anticipation of further advances westwards. And we have news of a continuing collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Toretsk. This is, in so many respects, the most difficult of all of the battles to understand exactly what is happening in Toretsk. But anyway, it looks as if large areas immediately to the south of Toretsk, large urban areas have now rapidly fallen under Russian control. It looks to me as if the Russians are now getting ever closer to that point where their two spearheads, the forces that have been advancing along the northern pincer in the Toretsk area, through villages like through the various villages that are located there, Pivnichne and Druzhba, and are now close to linking up with the Russian troops in New York, who are also, it seems, enlarging their area of control there. The Russians seem to control, if not all of Zalizny, a village south of Pivnichne. They certainly seem to control most of it. And as I said, with the Russians now controlling, as far as I can tell, most of New York as well, it looks as if, as I said, these two pincers are about to close. Any Ukrainian troops that lie south of these two pincers are likely to become trapped very soon. And that will be an actual cauldron, as opposed to this mythical cauldron that we've been hearing so much about near Progress. But anyway, a rapid collapse of Ukrainian defenses in the Toretsk area. It looks as if the Russians will soon have cleared all the villages to the south and east of Toretsk, New York, Nelipivka, Zhelanye. They already control Sumy. They already control most of Pivnichny. And that the Russians also are pushing up northward towards Alexandropil, cutting the Ukrainian supply lines along the H20 highway. The whole situation, as I said, in Toretsk looks like not a slow motion collapse, but actually a very rapid one. And where one had expected Ukrainian defenses in this area to be unyieldingly strong, whole city blocks in this area fall under Russian control practically every day. And lastly, if I can just complete this summary, same situation now, starting to take place in Volchansk, another major urban center where the fighting is very bad. We have had film from the Ukrainians of the fighting in northern Volchansk. The Ukrainians have copied what the Russians have done. They too have sent wheeled drones to attack Russian positions. These are not anywhere near as sophisticated as the sort of tracked and robotic drones that the Russians briefly tested in the Battle of Avdiivka. These seem to be simply wheeled or maybe even tracked vehicles which carry explosive, reach the position and then explode. That seems to be more like what they're about. It's been suggested that the Ukrainians are forced to do this because the Russian electronic warfare systems have now become so effective that the Russians are succeeding in jamming Ukrainian FPV drones. Anyway, let's put all that aside. The key thing is that this attack with these drones took place in buildings at the very eastern edge of the aggregate plant in Volchansk, which, to my mind, effectively confirms that the Russians now control nearly all of the aggregate plant. And the Russians, the group of forces north, tells us that they're now preparing to advance eastwards from the territory of the aggregate plant to cut off the men of the Ukrainian 71st Jaeger Brigade in the area of the high-rise buildings. And we can see that the Ukrainians, with this drone attack, this ground drone attack, have indeed placed the Russians exactly where, based on what group of forces north tell us, you would expect the Russians to be. So it looks as if the Russians are now in control of, let's say, 90% of the aggregate plant. It might be a bit more, it might be a bit less. It looks as if the Russians are preparing to encircle the Ukrainian troops in the area of the high-rise buildings. If the area of the high-rise buildings, the so-called citadel, collapses, defenses collapse, the Russians will be able quite rapidly to clear all the remaining part of Volchansk north of the Volcha River. They've already established foothold in southern Volchansk, south of the Volcha River. At that point, it seems to me that the Battle of Volchansk will be close to ended, and we will be looking at scenarios like the ones we're seeing play out in Chasov Yar and Krasnogorovka, where the capture of a large urban center, in this case Volchansk, becomes only a matter of time. Now, the fall of Volchansk would then open the way for the Russians to cut Ukrainian supply lines south towards Kupiansk and ETHEREUM. I'm not saying cut them completely, but anyway, interfere with them. The Russians are now well established in the areas east of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers. They've established strong positions around Siversk. It's likely that following the fall of Volchansk, we will see a concerted Russian attempt to break Ukrainian resistance in these places. So this is where we stand in the war. The Russian advance is accelerating, and the Ukrainians are finding it increasingly difficult to hold the Russians back. And I'm going to suggest that one major reason why this is so is, putting aside the equipment and ammunition shortages, there's also a fundamental problem of manpower. Now, some days ago, the Estonian Defence Ministry, I think it was the Estonian Defence Ministry, issued a report saying that the mobilization that is taking place in Ukraine is producing enough conscripts, or is producing conscripts who Ukraine, however, is obliged to send almost immediately to the front lines to fill gaps in the units which have suffered heavy losses as a result of the fighting. There are not enough conscripts recruited through this conscription process to enable Ukraine to build up reserves in the rear. And even despite this, most Ukrainian military formations on the front lines are still under strength, because however many men they receive, they are not enough to make up for losses. This is what, as I said, we have been told by, I believe it was the Estonians. And yesterday there was another report, one which I'm not sure of exact provenance. I heard about it on the Military Summary channel. But anyway, there was another report which apparently said that a study that's been carried out of Ukrainian military units shows that in spite of all of the efforts at mobilization, the core of the Ukrainian army continues to be men who joined the army in that great rush of volunteers that took place directly after the Russians crossed into Ukraine in February and March 2022. I'm going to suggest these were the most highly motivated men in Ukraine. They were probably the people who had provided the support for the Maidan uprising in 2013, 2014. They're deeply motivated and ideologically committed to Ukraine and to the Maidan project. When they heard that the Russians had advanced into Ukraine, they rallied to the defense of Ukraine. The rest of the population is much less keen to fight for Ukraine than these men are. And this is the reason why the Zelensky government has been so slow to order a further mobilization, and why, when troops are indeed mobilized, conscripts are indeed mobilized, they prove less willing to fight with a determination and skill that the recruits, the men who joined in February and March 2022, are still willing to do. And that is why we get more and more evidence of Ukrainian soldiers refusing orders to conduct attacks, more and more reports of Ukrainian soldiers surrendering, more and more reports of Ukrainian soldiers fleeing. We just had example of the Ukrainian soldiers who fled in the village, from the village of Progress, or at least from the area immediately to the north of that village. And on the question of surrenders, there was a report yesterday that a whole group of Ukrainian soldiers surrendered en masse to the Russians in one of the villages in the Dnieper River, located between the east and west banks of Kherson region. And there've been many other cases of surrender. There's been a steady trickle, a mounting trickle of surrenders by Ukrainian troops, basically since the fighting of the late autumn of last year. And of course, the equipment problems should not be overlooked as well. Now, there's been an extraordinary article, I think it was in the Washington Post, about the F-16 situation. Supposedly, there's only 6 Ukrainian pilots who've been trained up to the level of being able to operate these F-16s. The result is that the number of F-16s that can be deployed into the battle at any one point in time can only be apparently around 2, because the other F-16s and their pilots must take turns and rest before the F-16s can be deployed. Obviously, over time, more pilots will be trained, more F-16s will be dispatched, but the general consensus increasingly now seems to be that the F-16s cannot change the direction of the battle in Ukraine anymore. That this hope that was attached to the F-16s simply cannot be realized. Anyway, there we are. Now, perhaps because the situation in Ukraine has now become so bad, we're getting attempts to try and persuade us that the situation is not quite as bad as it appears. Yesterday, or rather the day before yesterday, on the 27th of July, a long article appeared in the Daily Telegraph by Roland Oliphant, a long-standing correspondent for the Daily Telegraph in the Daily Telegraph in Ukraine, and the title of the article reads, "How Russia's summer offensive is failing and what that means for Ukraine." And the subtitle goes on to say, "The Kremlin's big push was supposed to end the war, but there's been no grand breakthrough or Ukrainian collapse." Now, that subtitle already should ring alarm bells, because we're told about the Kremlin's big push, but have we actually seen a big push? Certainly the Russians have never announced one. They've never said that they are engaging in an all-out offensive in Ukraine. And the former defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, did discuss in various meetings that he had shortly before he was dismissed as defense minister and reappointed secretary of the Security Council. Anyway, he did refer to offensive actions, but he had never announced, and the Russians have never announced, a broad offensive. And of course, they've never announced any intentions for that offensive, whose very existence they've never confirmed. So they says that there was to be no grand breakthrough or Ukrainian collapse. Well, the Russians have never said that they were seeking a grand breakthrough. And as for the Ukrainian collapse, well, that might come. But for the moment, we're told that this is all, that we can see from the fighting that it's been more a case of aggressive attrition than anything else. Anyway, notwithstanding that, as I said, the Russians have announced no such goals. Roland Oliphant tells us with around 2 months of the summer left, that is to say the Russian offensive, has failed to achieve its most ambitious goals. But as I said, we don't know what those ambitious goals are supposed to have been because the Russians have never announced one. This is the contrast with the Ukrainian offensive of last summer, where the Ukrainians did announce their goals to capture Tokmak, eventually Melitopol, perhaps Mariupol as well, and to break through to the Sea of Azov and to the Black Sea. But there's never been any announcement of anything like that by the Russians at any point over the last few months. And by the way, Roland Oliphant talks about 2 months of the summer being left, as if that somehow suggests that the Russian offensive will stop in the autumn. It's worth pointing out that the Russian offensive, the ongoing Russian offensive, if one can describe this aggressive attrition as being an offensive, actually began in October, when the Russians first made their initial moves to capture Avdiivka. So it looks as if the autumn, the fact that autumn might be coming, the period of the Rasputitsa, that it's not quite the same sort of obstacle to the Russians as it is to the Ukrainians. The Rasputitsa, the spring Rasputitsa, seems to have been no kind of obstacle this year to the Russians at all. So there is no reason to think that when the summer ends, the Russians will stop. We've seen no evidence that they're stopping because of the seasons at all. That might have been what the Ukrainians found that they were obliged to do because their equipment isn't really adapted to functioning in the period of the Rasputitsa. Western supplied equipment is not, but it looks as if with the Russians it's different. Just saying. But anyway, he then goes on to say that Russian military has made progress, but it's been painfully slow and at immense cost. And that the British Defence Ministry has said that last week Russia suffered casualties of 1,262 and 1,262 and 1,162 per day in May and June, respectively. But of course, we have no independent corroboration of this. There's been no information about Russian losses from the Russian side, as we have occasionally had from the Ukrainian side. These loss figures appear to originate from Ukraine, and as I said, there's no independent corroboration for them. The actual raw figures provided by the Media Zona project do not corroborate these claims. On the contrary, as Simplicius the thinker pointed out some days ago, if you actually go to the Media Zona figures, if you go to their actual raw figures, they suggest that Russians' losses are actually relatively light and have been, in fact, so ever since last summer. Anyway, notwithstanding that, he then does admit Russian forces continue to advance, sometimes at an alarming pace. On Wednesday, the Ukrainian journalist Yuri Butuzov sounded the alarm about a critical situation near Pokrovsk, where he said the Russians had managed to take 4 miles in 1 week. And, well, I've already discussed the situation in Pokrovsk, and I've already discussed in previous programs what Butuzov had to say about it. Then there's a lengthy discussion by Roland Oliphant of the situation around Progress, which he describes, based upon, again, Ukrainian claims. We read, for example, about the Ukrainian the encirclement of the Ukrainian troops in progress and all of that. But anyway, he doesn't say very much more about the fighting, I notice, in other places. He doesn't really talk about the situation in Toretsk at all, for example. He says some extremely harsh things, undeservedly harsh things, about General Gerasimov, the overall Russian commander. But anyway, the overall sense of this article is that despite the fact that the Russians are making very significant progress, that they are indeed capturing all sorts of places, that they are indeed closing on Pokrovsk, that they're likely perhaps eventually to capture Chasov Yar, that their tactics, Russian tactics, have improved, and all of that, right down, to putting soldiers on motorcycles to ride as fast as possible to the enemy in the hope of not being hit, developing their so-called turtle tanks to protect them from FPV drones, all of that sort of thing. Despite all of that, nonetheless, overall, the situation somehow continues to be under control, and that all that the Ukrainians have to do is hold out for a little longer, and the help will come. The help from the West will come. And that their problems basically are still due to the fact that for 6 months, Congress in the United States would not authorize further appropriations for Ukraine, but in April, Congress did, and that more equipment has been sent, and the mobilization in Ukraine is changing the numbers position, and that provided that the Ukrainians can somehow hold things together, well, all can somehow be turned round. Even though, as I said, he does admit that the Russians will continue to advance at least until September. Well, as I said, I am completely unable to see how any of this is going to happen. Just as Oliphant doesn't address what's going on in Toretsk, for example, and is, in my opinion, very complacent about what's going on in Kharkiv region, where he seems to think that the Ukrainians have held the Russians back. He seems oblivious to the articles which have appeared in Reuters and on the website of Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, about how shell production in the United States and Europe is far below target, about how Patriot missile production is also far below target, how the F-16s are only going to come in limited numbers, and that there's insufficient numbers of Ukrainian pilots to fly them. He seems unaware of the reports from Estonia that the mobilization is only partially filling existing gaps in the Ukrainian formations, which are still under strength, and that there's no ability to build up reserves. I don't see myself how he thinks that the whole situation can be turned round. I suspect that this article, which I'm sure has been written in complete sincerity and good faith, by the way, but I suspect that this article is basically intended by Roland Oliphant to reassure both himself and his British readers that disastrous and catastrophic though the situation for Ukraine actually is, and despite the fact that it is things on the front lines are going from bad to worse, nonetheless, the Russians are still failing. Their offensive is still, as he puts it, a failure, that Russia's summer offensive is failing. And what does that mean for Ukraine? Well, if Russia's offensive is failing, despite the capture of Avdiivka or Cheretino, the likely soon capture of Chasov Yar, the cutting of the highway between Vuhledar and Konstantinovka, the approach to Pokrovsk, all of these things. If it is failing, then I do wonder what, if this is a failure, then I do wonder what Roland Oliphant would say of Ukraine's offensive last summer, which, to be frank, achieved no objectives at all. But anyway, put all that aside. I don't think articles like this are at all helpful in this situation. I understand the temptation to put a positive spin on an increasingly disastrous picture, but the fact remains that the picture continues to be disastrous, and it is getting steadily worse. The Ukrainians are indeed being pushed back everywhere along the front lines, exactly as Roland Oliphant admits. The Ukrainians are losing cities and losing towns, key villages, and their supply roads are now becoming threatened, and their key supply centres are becoming threatened as well. And there is no reason to think, as I said, that the Russian offensive, or rather, let's not call it an offensive, the Russian advance is simply going to stop in October. It didn't do so last October, and it didn't do so during the Rasputitsa period this spring. On the contrary, all the indicators are that the situation instead is going to continue to get worse and worse. And this is where we come back to the diplomacy. Now, the Russians have now made a whole series of comments about the fact that they simply do not believe these Ukrainian statements, comments about Ukraine now seeking a negotiated way out of the war. Nikolai Patrushev, the former secretary of the Security Council, Russia's Security Council, the man who used to be in charge of intelligence and who used to report to Putin on intelligence matters and who acted as Putin's national security advisor. Patrushev, who, by the way, now oversees Russia's shipbuilding industry, which is the area in which, by the way, he originally trained. Just saying. Anyway, Patrushev has now given an interview in which he says that these diplomatic overtures by the Ukrainians are completely insincere. All the Ukrainians are doing is playing for time. They want to lull us into some kind of situation where we agree to slow down or pause, and they are hoping to achieve that so that they can somehow retrieve this disastrous situation, and that they are not, in fact, prepared to make any substantial concessions at all. And I said the same about, based upon Zelensky's truly terrible interview with Japanese television, in which Zelensky, again, made it fairly clear that as far as he's concerned, the only basis that Ukraine is prepared to talk is the basis is Russia's complete capitulation, something which, given that it is Ukraine, not Russia, which is losing the war, simply isn't going to happen. So we are in a situation where it does seem to me that various countries are trying to get the Ukrainians to see sense. Hungary, Viktor Orban went to Kiev. China, India, Brazil, all of these attempts to get the Ukrainians to moderate their position, all of them are being spurned. I feel that this is indeed Ukraine's last chance. If Ukraine cannot bring itself to make substantive concessions now, then I really do not see that there is anything that can prevent the war from being fought until the Russians achieve a military conclusion. Now, this morning, I got a further email from someone who is well informed about the military situation. Again, I can't discuss this person. I don't want to give details as to who this person actually is, because obviously I don't want to disclose anything about this person's identity. But suffice to say, I'm now getting from this person news about another massive build-up by the Russians on Ukraine's northern borders. In Kharkiv and Sumy region, I'm told that there's perhaps 100,000 men, Russian troops, starting to be focused along that area. Now, that might be an overstatement, but it is not impossible. Bear in mind that a few days ago, in an interview to The Guardian, the Ukrainian military chief, General Syrsky, said that there's around 500,000 Russian troops fighting in Ukraine at the present time, but that the Russians propose to increase that number to 690,000, around 700,000, by the end of this year. So if we are talking about a Russian force of, say, 50,000 men already fighting in the area around Kharkiv region and Belgorod, in places like Volchansk, then it could be, it's not impossible, that we could see another 200,000 join them over the next few weeks or months, perhaps even more. And this person has provided me with a most interesting map, pointing out how if these forces are committed en masse into the battle, the Russians could split the Ukrainian forces in northern Kharkiv, along the northern front lines, and how the way towards Kiev would itself open up. And this person has again reminded me that not so long ago, just a few days ago in fact, Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's own intelligence chief, came forward and said that the situation on the front lines in the north is deteriorating, and that he didn't want to say anything about it because if he did, that might create a mood of panic. Now, if there is this enormous build-up by the Russians taking place along Ukraine's northern border, presumably the United States is aware of it. After all, back in 2021, they gave us a fair amount of information, quite accurate information, about Russian troop positions before the Russians began their special military operation. So why is the United States this time saying so little? Why, in fact, are they unwilling to discuss this situation on the northern border? Could it be that the United States itself, or at least the administration, also does not want to create a sense of crisis in the run-up to the election in November? Just saying. But if so, what happens if the Russians do, in fact, cross the border, and the disaster that Budanov appears elliptically to be warning about actually happens? And what also is this Russian advance in the north is combined with another Russian attack in the south, in Zaporozhye region, where the Russians are supposed to have assembled 90,000 men. And what happens also if key towns like Chasov Yar and Krasnogorovka and perhaps Toretsk either fall or are about to fall? Well, there is no evidence at all that in the West anybody is preparing for that kind of possibility. And of course, the administration itself doesn't seem to be willing to take any initiative by itself. If the Ukrainians are indeed facing this enormous build-up by the Russians on their northern border, their earnest and pleading demands for missile strikes across the border towards these Russian positions start to have a more rational quality about them, just saying. But it seems that Western governments are too paralyzed to agree to that, which is probably just as well, given how the Russians are likely to respond. And I discussed some programs ago how the Ukrainians are apparently becoming increasingly desperate, how the conversation between Belarus and Austin spoke about a really wild and extreme Ukrainian plan, which the Russians wanted to make sure that the Americans knew about and wanted to make sure that the Americans were not involved in. Another source, has told me that the speculation that he is aware of in the Duma, or at least in Russia, points to this plan being one of three possible things. Either an attempted assassination attempt on Putin himself, or perhaps on Dmitry Medvedev, who some people in Ukraine think would take over from Putin if Putin were indeed put out of the way. That's one possibility. The second is a Ukrainian attack with missiles on nuclear facilities inside Russia, including Russian nuclear weapons facilities. And the third is perhaps a strike against Moscow and St. Petersburg. And apparently the Russians have made it clear, or at least this source believes that the Russians have made it clear that if these things happen, if any of these things happen, and the Russians identify a Western trace, well, the consequences will be very dire indeed. And if Western missiles are used in some of these attacks on nuclear installations, including nuclear weapons installations, or on Moscow and St. Petersburg, then the Russians will assume a Western trace and will make their decisions accordingly. So, a fairly desperate mood in Ukraine. And again, I do wonder whether Western governments are fully aware of all of that. Maybe they're still keeping their fingers crossed and are expecting or hoping that there will be some kind of sudden implosion in the Russian economy. As I said, there was an article, a letter to the Guardian that appeared a couple of days ago, signed off by the finance ministers of some of the Baltic states, together with the Netherlands, which insisted that the sanctions are indeed working in Russia. Maybe some people will seize on the recent increase in interest rates in Russia. As proof of that, it is not proof of that. It is proof that the central bank itself has underestimated the scale of Russia's economic recovery, that the Russian economy is growing faster, much faster than the central bank itself expected, and that this is not based, and as I reiterate what I said a couple of days ago about this, it is not based upon spending, government spending. It is based on the central bank's own failure to give correct signals about interest rates. Now, some people have pushed back on the last point, but take this comment made by Elvira Nabiullina at the press conference that she gave on the 26th after the interest rate increase was announced, in which she defends the central bank's guidance, the guidance that the central bank gave in the earlier part of this year, that there would be reductions in interest rates later over the course of this year. She said this: what did we see at the beginning of the year from the data? That current inflation had slowed significantly from its autumn peaks. Inflation expectations had eased, labour market tensions had at least stopped growing, monetary conditions had tightened, growth in consumer activity had slowed down, and at the same time, the population's propensity to save had grown. This is reflected in our forecasts and in the forecasts of experts. At the time, our forecast, based on the data available at the beginning of the year, envisaged room for rate reduction this year. And perhaps the confidence of experts, the financial market, and business was underpinned by the fact that over 10 years of inflation targeting, this was the first case of cyclical overheating when rates needed to stay high for an extended period to cool demand. Our updated rate forecast does not assume a rate cut this year. In other words, what Nabiullina is saying is that she made a mistake. Instead of signaling to the markets at the start of this year that rates would be cut over the course of 2024 from the high positions that they had reached, she should have recognized that with the economy pushing forward on all cylinders, powering forward on all cylinders, she needed instead to signal that monetary policy would remain tight indefinitely in order to dampen expectations and to start to pull inflation down. Instead, by signaling that interest rates would fall in conditions of a consumer and investment, of an ongoing consumer and investment boom, borrowers and lenders took their cue from her and decided that the moment had come to borrow and lend even more. Well, one shouldn't be too critical of Nabulin, and I'm not, by the way, in this case. This is an extraordinary situation in which the Russian economy finds itself in. I'm quite certain that Nabulina in 2022, after the sanctions were imposed, never imagined that she would be dealing with the kind of situation in which the Russian economy finds itself in today. And she probably felt, as most people would have done in the beginning of this year, that with inflation falling down, interest rates also needed to be reduced in order to make sure that the investment boom was not choked off. So she reduced interest rates. She underestimated the scale of the boom, and that was a mistake, but she's corrected it. And she's corrected it, by the way, in the right way. She's making it clear that interest rates will remain high indefinitely. She's refusing to forecast another reduction. And she's also talking about lower growth in the economy next year. All of which, as I said, is intended to dampen demand and to bring inflation back under control. I have no doubt at all that she will succeed. Nabulina's record here has been very strong. And to the extent that there has been a fiscal expansion, and Nabulina herself, as I said in other comments, also admitted that it's demand for credit that has been fueling more than anything else the overheating that we've been seeing in the economy this year. Anyway, to the extent that there's been a fiscal stimulus, I expect it will start to fade away by the end of this year as the government starts to increase taxes, partly also with the intention of mopping up extra demand, but also as the major investments that were made to try to keep the economy growing, in other words, the anti-crisis measures, plus the inputs to increase output in the defense industries, as all of that starts to reduce, because the investments to achieve those things have achieved the effect that they were intended to. So that's what I think. Central bankers, even the best of them, and I think Nabulina, by most agreements, is a very able central banker, make mistakes. She's made mistakes before. In my opinion, as I've said previously, she kept interest rates too high between 2014 and 2017 for much too long. But she has, I think, grown in experience, and I think she's made the right decision, and all the indications are that the government overall, and Putin himself, support her. Anybody who is saying to themselves, expecting that there's going to be an implosion of the economy in Russia, a collapse there, and that is going to rescue Ukraine, is deluding themselves. They would be deluding themselves about the military situation. They would be deluding themselves about the economic situation as well. I think an awful lot of that illusion is still out there. I'm sorry to say. And I'm afraid I have come round to the bitter belief that this war is going to end militarily. I don't know whether the information provided by this source is correct about a Russian advance towards Kiev, but if it happens at some point before the end of this year, I, for one, will not be surprised. And anyway, we have been warned. Let me finish my program at this point. There'll be more from me soon again. Much to talk about in the Middle East and the American election. Not a subject, I must admit, that I'm especially attracted to covering, but anyway, there it is. So more from me soon. I'll be back again tomorrow. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work also via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop. Links for all of these things under this video. Please also remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.